Welcome to this WiseOwl Excel VBA tutorial. In this video we're going to see how to loop through all Outlook folders and subfolders to produce a complete list of everything in a single Outlook account. We'll start by looking at how to get a reference to the root folder and then how to loop through the items in that folder. We'll move on and look at how we can then loop through the subfolders collection within a folder and then create a recursive procedure to continue doing that to follow the entire hierarchy of folders and subfolders in the account. The final part of the video will focus on writing out those item details in a sensible format to Excel. We'll cover things like leaving blank lines and indenting things appropriately to create a nice layout. So let's get started. In previous videos in this series, we've looked at how to loop over all of the items in a single Outlook folder, whether that was a standard built-in folder such as Inbox or a custom folder you've created yourself. In this video, we're going to learn how to start at the root folder of your Outlook account and then process all of the items in every single folder and subfolder and sub-subfolder and so on through the entire chain of every folder in the account. To get started, let's head into Excel and create a brand new blank workbook, head into the Visual Basic Editor and then insert a new module. To make this system work, we're going to need to create two separate subroutines. The first one will be quite simple. Its sole job really is to get a reference to the root folder. So let's create a sub called Get Root Folder. The final thing that this subroutine will do is call the subroutine that does most of the work, and this subroutine is going to list all of the items in the first folder and then automatically call itself to go through each subfolder in that one. So let's call this one something like List Items and Subfolders. Let's start writing the basic code in the Get Root Folder subroutine. We'll need to declare some variables referencing some Outlook items. So let's head to the Tools menu first and choose References. And then from the list, find Microsoft Outlook, whichever version number you happen to have installed on your machine. On my machine, it's Outlook 16.0 Object Library. Check the box next to it and then click OK. We'll need three variables in this first subroutine. Let's declare the first variable dim OL as Outlook.application. We'll say dim NS as Outlook.namespace. And then finally dim root folder as Outlook.folder. We can then set what these variables reference. We'll set OL to be equal to a new instance of the Outlook application. We can say set NS equal to OL.getNamespace. And if you've watched the previous videos in this series, you'll know that we can only use the mappy namespace here. And then finally, I want to get access to the first folder, the overall root folder of the namespace. So I'm going to say set root folder equals ns.folders1. So the first folder at the root level of that namespace. The next thing I'd like to do in the Get Root Folder subroutine is call the List Items and Subfolders subroutine and pass a reference to the root folder into that procedure. In order to be allowed to do that, I'll need to declare a parameter in this subroutine. So let's declare a parameter, let's call it parent folder as Outlook.folder. What that means I can then do back in the Get Root Folder subroutine is say List Items and Subfolders. You can press Ctrl and Spacebar on the keyboard just to get a bit of help from the IntelliSense list here. List Items and Subfolders followed by a space, and it's telling me that I can pass in, or in fact I need to pass in, a reference to an Outlook folder into this procedure. So the reference I'm going to pass is a reference to my root folder. I can now access the folder whose reference I've passed into the subroutine using the parameter name parent folder. So one of the first things I might like to do here is print out the name and maybe the path of the folder I've passed in. So let's have a simple debug.print statement just while we're testing things. Debug.print parent folder.name, and then let's also say parent folder, parent folder was what I was going for, parent folder dot folder path is what I'll go for. I'd also like this subroutine to list all the items from the folder whose reference I've passed in, and to do that we can use a for each loop to process the items collection. Because the items collection can contain a variety of different types of object, so for Outlook items they could be one of a number of different types of things, we're going to use a generic object variable to hold a reference. So let's say dim I, short for item, as object. And then after we've written out the folder name, we can say for each I in parent folder dot items. Let's just close the loop by saying next I. And then inside the loop, again, let's just debug.print something. We can say debug.print, and we'll go with some of the common properties that any item in Outlook will have. So things like I.subject is a common property. Of course, I don't get any IntelliSense because I'm using a generic object type rather than a specific class. So I.subject. I can also say I.class, so we can find out what class of item we're looking at. And then perhaps also we can say I.creationTime. So 3 common properties of any object in Outlook. Let's have a quick look at the results of this pair of subroutines as it stands. Let's display the immediate window by either pressing Ctrl and G or choosing View Immediate Window. And then if we return to the Get Root Folder subroutine, let's use the F8 key just to step through this procedure. So the first few things that will happen aren't particularly exciting. We're just getting references to the various objects we need. Now we're going to pass a reference to the root folder of my Outlook account into the List Items and Subfolders procedure. So here we're going to first of all print out the folder's name and its path. There we go. And then we're going to look at all of the items that belong to that folder. Now the root folder itself doesn't actually contain any items at all. It's the folders inside the root that contain the items. So this is going to simply skip over this for each loop and then end that subroutine and then return to the original calling procedure and end that one as well. The key thing to understand about how this system is going to work is that every single Outlook folder object has a folders property that returns all of its subfolders. What we're going to do is use that to create a second loop in our List Items and Subfolders procedure. Let's declare a new variable. I'm going to call mine subfol as outlook.folder. What I can then do is, after I've finished looping through the items in the parent folder, I can create another for each loop, this time for each subfol, in parent folder dot folders. Then I can say next subfol to move on to the next one. The really clever part of this system is what we do inside this second for each loop. What we'd like to do for each subfolder is call a procedure which lists out all of the items in that subfolder, followed by looking at all of the subfolders in that one, and then listing out all the items in each of those, and then the subfolders, and so on and so on and so on. So basically, the procedure that we want to call is the one that we're sort of in the middle of writing. So we're going to recursively call the List Items and Subfolders procedure, so List Items and Subfolders. And the folder reference that we want to pass in is whichever subfolder we're currently looking at in this second loop, so the for each subfol loop. That's an example of a recursive procedure call, so a line inside one subroutine which calls itself. Let's just see what happens now when we start stepping through our main procedure. I'm going to clear the contents of the immediate window, head back to the first procedure, the one that sets everything going, get root folder, use F8 to begin stepping through. So again, the first few things that happen aren't particularly exciting. We'll print out the parent folder name, as we've seen before, and then any items that belong to it. As there aren't any items in the root folder, that just skips over that first for each loop. Now the interesting thing happens. We start looping over the subfolder objects inside our main parent folder. So we call our same procedure, we recursively call List Items and Subfolders, and then this time we can see that the first subfolder happens to be called Deleted Items, and then we list out any items that happen to belong to that folder. It looks like there's at least one, some old email about an old Dell contact apparently, and then something else, probably an invoice. And then we go into each subfolder in the deleted items folder. Now, because the deleted items folder does not have any subfolders, it will jump over that loop and then end that procedure. Now at this point, what we have is two open copies of the list items and subfolders procedure. You can see that at any point when you're stepping through procedures by viewing something called the call stack. If I head to the View menu and choose View Call Stack, I can see a list of all of the currently running procedures. So my Get Root folder one is running still, my original list items and subfolders, and then this second copy. If I close this window down, when I reach the end sub for this version of the list items and subfolders procedure, that one will end and it returns to the point that it had reached in the original call. If I go back to view the call stack again, it shows me that I'm down to a single instance of list items and subfolders. Carrying on with the next subfolder, this time I can see that I'm going to go to the inbox folder. So I now have another call to the list items and subfolders procedure. View the call stack, and there's the new instance open. So here we're going to loop through the items in the inbox, so I can see that I get the items listed out into the immediate window, and so on and so on and so on. I'm going to stop running this at this point just to avoid going through the many hundreds, maybe thousands of items I have in my Outlook account. I don't really want you to see all of those, it's quite boring. So I'm just going to reset the entire thing. But hopefully you can see at this point that we're going into each individual folder from a given root level. And that's the important part. Now, in order to make this system actually useful, rather than writing the contents of each folder into the immediate window, we can choose to write them out to an Excel worksheet instead. Let's just close the immediate window and add a line of code to the original GetRoot folder subroutine, which creates a new worksheet. That's straightforward enough. We can simply say worksheets.add before we begin looping through the items and subfolders. I'd also like to keep track of the number of items I've processed so that I know which row number in the new worksheet to write the details into. Because I need to keep track of that across multiple calls to procedures, it makes sense to declare this as a module level variable. So somewhere towards the top of the module, I'm going to declare a private. I can just say dim, I suppose, here, but I'm going to say private to indicate that it's unique to this single module, private n as long. So that should give me enough overhead in case I have many hundreds of thousands or millions of items. Okay, having done that, I want to initialize my private variable within my initial GetRoot folder subroutine. So I'm going to initialize n to be equal to 1, otherwise it begins at 0. What I can then do is, within the list items and subfolders procedure, is I can write out the name of the parent folder and its path into cells in the worksheet rather than just debug.printing them. So when we create a new worksheet, that becomes the active sheet. I can reference the cells property of the worksheet using n for the row number and then simply hard coding the column number, so n, 1. So that will, in the first instance, that will be cell A1 on this sheet. Cells n, 1 dot value equals parent folder dot name. On the next line, I can say cells n, 2 dot value equals parent folder dot folder path. We'll use the same technique to write out the details of each email into the worksheet as well, but we need to make sure that we increase the value of n for each new item that we encounter. So inside the first for each loop for each I in parent folder dot items, we can say n equals n plus 1. Again then, rather than debug.printing the values to the immediate window, we can say cells n, 1 dot value equals, we can go for I.subject, and then a quick little bit of manipulation, we can say, let's go for cells n, 2 equals I.class, so we know what type of item we're looking at. And then finally, we can say cells n, 3 dot value equals creation time. When we move on to a new subfolder, I'd like to leave a blank line before I start listing out its name and then the items belonging to it. So I can use a similar technique to the one we've just used to increment the value of n. This time I'm going to make n equals n plus 2. So that will give me a blank line between each individual folder. Now let's have a look at what this returns for us. So we can return to our GetRoot folder subroutine, choose to run it, see that we end up with a new worksheet. Might take a little while to run depending on how busy your Outlook account is. Mine's taking quite a while. There are a lot of items in there. Let's have a look then once it's finished at the Excel worksheet, and there we go. So I've got a list of my folder names, including the folder path next to it. Then below each folder I've got a list of the subjects of those objects and the class, and then finally the time it was created. One other thing it might be nice to do is indicate in some way the level of the hierarchy that each item belongs to. So for instance, we could have each email item indented one space below the folder name, for example, so shifting these things along to the right. And then if we have subfolders, again we have a level of indenting indicating what position they occupy in the hierarchy. One way to do that is to incorporate a second parameter within our list, items and subfolders procedure. So what we can do is declare a parameter which indicates the indent level. Now I don't want this indent level parameter to be affected by subsequent calls to the same subroutine. So I'm going to declare this one as by val. So this means that the information will be passed by value rather than by reference, meaning it won't be affected by any code in subsequent calls. Let's say by val indent level as, let's go for integer. I'm pretty sure I won't have more than 32 and a bit thousand levels of hierarchy in my particular Outlook folder structure. Now that I've declared that second parameter, I need to make sure that I pass a value to it each time I call the list items and subfolders procedure. So let's go back to the root folder or get root folder procedure. The initial call I will make to this subroutine, I'll pass in an indent level of 1. What I'd like to do each subsequent time I call the list items and subfolders procedure is make sure that I have the same indent level for each subfolder within the parent folder. So I don't just want to simply increment indent level each time I call the procedure. That would mean that I'd get things like my newsletters, eBuyer would be at one level and then SQL Server would be at the next indent level. I want all of the items at the same indent level within one subfolder. So let's declare another variable in my list items and subfolders procedure. Let's call this something like next indent level as integer. And then before I start looping through the subfolders, we'll increment the value of indent level. So we can say next indent level equals indent level plus 1. Finally, when I call my list items and subfolders procedure, I can pass in next indent level. Now all we need to do is reference the indent level to set the cell into which the various details will be written. So rather than cells n,1.value equals parent folder.name, I'm going to say cells n, indent level. And then to offset the parent folder path one column to the right, I can say indent level plus 1. So indent level plus 1. And I can do exactly the same thing when I'm writing out the details of each item. So I can say, in fact, let's just copy and paste this to speed things up. Cells n, indent level plus 1, indent level plus 2, and indent level plus 3. A quick test run then from the main procedure. If I scroll back up to get root folder, when I run that one this time, again, it takes a little while to run, but once it's finished, we should be able to see a slightly neater layout for the items whose details we're getting. So here we go, we can see the subfolders below the root all indented at the correct level. So I've got deleted items, inbox, outbooks, all at the same level. And then within each of those, I've got the individual items at the same indent level as well. Now, of course, there are many other things we could do to improve the formatting of this workbook, but as those are fairly trivial things to do, I think I'll leave those in your capable hands. The important thing is you now know how to loop over all of the folders and subfolders and sub-subfolders and so on from the root folder of your Outlook account. The last thing I'll quickly mention is that you don't have to start at the absolute root of your Outlook account. Let's say, for example, you wanted to loop through all of the items starting at the newsletters folder. when you set up the root folder, you can reference any specific folder in your Outlook account. We talked about how to reference folders by name in a previous video. Just as a very quick example, I could refer to the folders collection of the first folder in the namespace and refer to the newsletters folder. And having done that, when I run the subroutine again, I'm going to end up with a new worksheet which contains just the items belonging to the newsletters folders. So there's quite a lot of flexibility still in the system that we've written. Hopefully you've found some of the ideas here useful. Thanks for watching. See you next time.